Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Thursday, May 19th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 108 days. The game against Michigan in 192 days. If you listened to yesterday's show, you heard Mark Givler talking about a non-Power 5 coach he spoke with who was going all across the country to meet with players who are way out of his school's league as recruits, but who he wanted to build relationships with in case they ever entered the transfer portal. Now that represents a pretty fundamental shift in the recruiting model, talking to high school players with an eye on bringing them in not necessarily as freshmen, but potentially later through the portal, and it's not just one school that's doing it. Today we're going to be talking about another pretty significant shift that the portal and the NIL have brought about, which is elite players transferring and the complicated decisions around whether or not they're worth adding for a short-term boost. Tony Gerdeman just wrote about exactly that, a really interesting piece that he wrote this week. He joins me now to discuss that. Tony, thanks for being here.
Tom, as always, thank you for the invite. It is always a rare and a pleasing experience.
Well, it was a pleasing experience for Pitt last year to have wide receiver Jordan Addison. He was the player you wrote about, and I would guess that most people listening to this podcast probably know at least a little bit the basics on who he is, but just in case, can you please give folks an idea of what kind of player we're going to be talking about in Jordan Addison?
Yeah, Jordan Addison, a former Pitt wide receiver who last year caught 100 passes for 1,593 yards and 17 touchdowns as a true sophomore. And that was after a freshman season of catching over 600 yards as a true freshman. And so then he wins the Biletnikoff Award in 2021 following his outstanding season. And throughout the offseason, Pitt had to deal with programs coming after Jordan Addison. And we talked about this maybe a month or so ago on one of the podcasts about Pat Narduzzi saying that all of these teams, head coach Pat Narduzzi saying like a dozen teams came after Jordan Addison, but they shut it down. They got the door closed, and Jordan Addison is going to be a Pitt Panther. And then you start hearing all of the rumors about USC being involved and back channels, and Jordan Addison is coming right down to the deadline of the May 1st deadline of you have to get into the portal to get your free no waiver or your waiver for not having to sit out. And so you're just waiting for it. And then he finally enters, and now he is still in the portal. And it is interesting that maybe USC is not the lock that everybody thought, unless that's what he wants everybody to think. So it doesn't look like tampering, Tom.
Yeah, and he has been linked to USC since even before he entered the portal, which that tampering has been a word that has been thrown around a good bit by at least on Pitt message boards and maybe by folks a little more directly affiliated with Pitt than message board posters. But since hitting the portal, it feels like the battle for his services has maybe gotten a little more competitive. You've seen a couple other names thrown around in terms of big name schools, and there was even one report that had Ohio State theoretically maybe in the orbit somehow around Jordan Addison. Can you sort of explain who else is sort of in the running right now in addition to USC?
Yeah, so Jordan Addison has taken visits to Texas and Alabama as well as the USC. So you get into the portal and now everybody sees, oh, well, shoot, there's maybe the top free agent in college football sitting in the portal. So let's get involved in those two programs have gotten involved along with USC. And then there was a report from the Texas Rivals site, and I don't know exactly what it said, but there is a mention of Jordan Addison maybe sitting tight for a little bit longer, waiting to see if Ohio State would be interested. And as a receiver, why not? You saw Ohio State put 2 receivers in the first round, and 2.5 maybe if you want to include Jamison Williams in that. So if you are a wide receiver in the transfer portal and you're pretty good, why wouldn't you wait to hear if Ohio State is going to be contacting you? But also, if Ohio State was going to be contacting you, you wouldn't be waiting for almost 3 weeks now to hear from them. They would have done it right away.
Yeah, if once your name's in the portal, I think Ohio State has people who monitor these kinds of things. So yes, you would assume that if there was interest there, you would have heard by now. But this kind of gets to the conversation, because generally in the past, if you had the opportunity to bring in a player who was considered the best in his position in the previous year, you would do it and not think twice. And Jordan Addison won the Biletnikoff Award as the best wide receiver in the country. And Ohio State players and coaches and fans may have thoughts on that voting process, but that was what the voters decided. And, you couldn't really just do that, just bring in instant eligibility, major award winner in previous eras. But, if you could have, every other team in the nation would have happily added an Orlando Pace or an Antoine Winfield or a Malcolm Jenkins or someone like that. So, but now it seems like that decision is not quite so clear cut. I mean, Ryan Day had some really interesting things to say about Ohio State's philosophy on recruiting from the portal. They've done it. They're not opposed to it, but it feels like they haven't done it nearly as much as a lot of other teams have. So what did Ryan Day have to say about that?
Yeah, and this was something he talked about well before the Jordan Addison thing, so I don't want people to think this is in response to Jordan Addison, but in discussing recruiting from the portal, he said it's a little disingenuous to, as you're recruiting players, talking to their players and talking to the families of those players about the opportunity to play at Ohio State and how we are going to develop you, and that, it's the brotherhood, it's family. We are trying to get the best out of you for your own good, and then also obviously for Ohio State's own good. But then as you're telling them this, you then go to the portal to bring in somebody in front of them and to take their spot. And so that's where, depending on the message that you are providing to these recruits and their families, once you start going against that message, then there's some distrust there. And that's not really what Ryan Day is looking for in his program. And not, as you said, not that they won't go to it, but how many times have we heard him say it has to be the right fit? There has to be the need, a hole there that they have to fill. But really they prefer the high school route because that creates sustainability. Whereas if you are always having to grab somebody from the portal, what happens if there is nobody there that year? And so then now you've got a hole that you could have avoided through proper recruiting and development. And so the reliance on the portal is something that I don't think anybody wants to do. It's the programs that have to do it where, it's a lot like the keeping the plates spinning. You're always trying to keep those plates spinning, and some programs can, like the plates spin on their own and come to them like Alabama does. But Ohio State, for what they want to do, if the players are living up to their bargain, Ryan Day feels like Ohio State needs to live up to theirs.
Yeah, it does feel like there's that delicate balance with the portal where you could, and let's just use the Addison example again. You could bring in someone like Addison, get 1 year out of him, but then in the process, do you lose 2 or 3 younger guys from that position group who, either were, in their minds, their plan was to be, okay, I'm going to be the starter. I'm going to be getting X number of reps this year. And then once you get knocked off of that, then not only do you have that, but you have that trust issue you mentioned there. So, is it worth 1 year of Addison to potentially lose 2 or 3 younger guys who would potentially have multiple years left? And, there's no guarantee any of them turn into Biletnikoff winners, but, you run the risk of losing some of those guys. But then also, you talked about the trust within the program. It feels like there's also potentially a longer term impact there as well in recruiting.
Yeah, absolutely. When you see, when coaches say one thing and do another, that can create some issues. People will remember that. And I know some people are listening to this right now or watching this and thinking, well, Nick Saban wouldn't have a problem with it. Nick Saban would just bring him in. Nick Saban has had wide receiver issues since they lost Devontae Smith and all of those guys. You saw Jameson Williams come in last year and be the man because the only other guy they had was basically John Mechie. Oh, now both of those guys are gone. So they're clearly looking for some guys. They already brought in a receiver from Louisville. I think they brought in another. And so they're kind of in a position where they don't have the depth that Ohio State has. So yeah, they're looking to bring in talented guys if they can. And obviously Texas would love to have somebody to pair with Xavier Worthy. And then USC with Lincoln Riley, they have, I think, about 50 or 60 player movement, either coming or going since he took over. And so they need all the bodies they can get, all the talent they can get. And, they've got the quarterback Caleb Williams from Oklahoma as well. So it's a situation where you're right, Tom. You get away the pros and the cons. And right now at Ohio State, you look at what they have. They have Jackson Smith and Jigba, so they've got a number one. And there's nobody that follows Ohio State, that works for Ohio State, that coaches or plays at Ohio State, that isn't incredibly excited to see what Marvin Harris and Julian Fleming and Emeka Egbuka can do this year, having a larger role in the offense. And they've bided their time. They've waited. They've worked. Like I said, they've lived up to everything they've been asked to do. So when they do that, and you bring in somebody else to move in front of them, it creates distrust. It creates you lose part of that brotherhood that they talk about, or just the culture takes some cracks as well. And I know the example is always Alabama, but you don't know what Nick Saban is telling his players. There may be a much more cutthroat thing there with, like, if you're not living up to it, then, is it a more NFL approach there, or just like I said, a cutthroat thing? And it feels like the SEC operates a little bit differently in terms of how they handle these things, but also it's what the coaches are telling them and also what the program needs. And as I said, Alabama needs receivers, so it's to compare them in Ohio State right now isn't really the same animal.
I'm just thinking right now about titling this on YouTube. What's wrong with Alabama football? Why can't they develop their own wide receivers? Yeah, I mean, this is like the conversation we had about Michigan quarterbacks at one point, where it was like they just had this. You had to bring in a Jake Rudock because they just could not develop their own guys. And it's not like Ryan Day has been completely opposed to bringing in transfer players. They have brought in guys in very specific situations where they really need an offensive lineman. Okay, you bring in a Jonah Jackson. They really need a quarterback. Okay, they bring in a Justin Fields. They really need a running back. You bring in a Trey Sermon. All of those guys worked out great, were major impact players for Ohio State. They have not had a lot of misses in the transfer portal or in previous instant grad transfer, instant eligibility, grad transfer kind of situations. So, yeah, I think there's a little bit of benefit of the doubt that they probably deserve at this point until you have a bunch of misses. Because, yeah, I mean, they as often as they talk about culture, it does feel like that's something that's going to be a real, that's a real point of emphasis. It's something they really do believe in. It's not just sort of a term that they toss around, in an empty form. They really do kind of believe in it. So yes, I would not expect to see Jordan Addison at Ohio State this year. And as crazy as that sounds, they may be better off without bringing in the guy who was judged the best wide receiver in the country last year. College football, what a time to be alive. Always a lot to talk about though. So as someone with a daily podcast, Jeff, definitely appreciate college football continually churning out news and topics for us to discuss. It is, this is supposed to be the boring time of year, and yet there's always something to talk about. So, hope you guys enjoyed hearing us talk about that. If you did, you will probably also enjoy hearing us talk about college football on the Buckeye Weekly podcast. Tony Gerdeman and I just dropped a new episode of that yesterday, talking about Ohio State's TV schedule. We're starting to get the pieces for this fall schedule, where they're going to be on TV, when they're going to be on TV, kickoff times, all that kind of stuff. We took a run at. We did a pretty good job looking at that a couple weeks ago. Now that we've got more information, we can make a little bit more of an informed guess on some other kickoff times as well. So you can check that out. We'll have another listener question show a little later on this week. So you can find Buckeye Weekly wherever you find this. Just search either Buckeye Weekly or Buckeye Scoop to find it. You can subscribe right there and leave us a 5-star rating and review as well. And you should do that for all of our other great podcasts. Alex Gleitman does Around the Oval. Bill Green and Mark Givler do Gives in the Bank. And Kevin Noon does the Big Me Kickoff. All great shows, all worth listening to, all stuff I listen to. So all good stuff from good people who know what they're talking about with Ohio State football. So make sure you check all of those out. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.